This is the 2019 Range Rover. It has a 5-liter V8 engine that is intercooled and supercharged. This is the long wheelbase model, which was originally designed for you to be chauffeured around, especially given how much room you have in the back as a passenger. Saying that this is spacious just really does not do it justice. It of course has all the bells and whistles, like lane departure, distance pacing cruise control, blind spot sensors. It even has 19 speakers, but the coolest thing is it even has massage seats and a built-in cooler. Literally, how cool is that? This is the Ritz-Carlton of SUVs, but don't let it fool you. Land Rover claims to have invented the SUV, and I can certainly see why. This thing might look slick, but it can quite literally climb a mountain. This Fuji White 518 horsepower V8 behemoth is a courtesy of our good friends at Land Rover Columbia. I pass by their dealership each day on I-26 coming in from Chapin, and they couldn't be nicer. This can be yours for just $129,000, but hey, it does at least get over 20 miles to the gallon. I am Jordan Stallings with our show, Brokers in Cars, Talking Contracts. Each week we ride around in some really cool cars with some somewhat cool real estate brokers talking about the contract. Today, our special guest is Brandon Hoffman. Our firm has represented Brandon's company for many years, and Gary even claims that he used to beat the snot out of Brandon in softball, but you know who really knows the truth.
So hey Brandon, how's it going, man? Is everything going at your office?
Man, it's going swimmingly.
Swimmingly, good.
I like it. Yeah, we've been so busy, it's hard keeping up, but as the market has shifted, we're starting to get a lot more questions about sale and closing contingencies. And I know we don't use those. We haven't used them terribly often in the past, but now we do.
We've started to see them all the time as well. And I was just talking to an agent about this the other day. One thing I always recommend is look at the CCRA contract version that you're presented with if you're on the listing side. If you see 12-2016, that's good. That's the one we're always talking about. So, just to preface anything, my answer for you with the close contingencies and sell and close, we want to make sure we're using that version of the contract. And of course, if so, then we're talking about paragraph 16, which I'm sure you know is one of those where it's now a checkbox instead of, and a corresponding addendum, instead of there just being the whole section written out right there for formerly 16A and 16B.
You're right. The new addendum seems to be vastly superior to what we used to use back in the day, but I do have some questions about it.
Yeah, let's fire away. Let's go.
Well, why don't we start with what's the difference between the closing contingency addendum and the sale and closing addendum?
Sell and close is effectively a buyer saying, this contract that I'm presenting to you, or this offer, is contingent on receiving a contract for my house. Whereas the closing contingency works a little bit different, of course, where you have a contract already presented to that buyer's for their house, and they're now saying, once we close, then that contingency is going to be passed for me to now purchase your home. So it's just basically a factual difference there between the two.
Okay, well that makes sense. So if someone has a sale and closing contingency, when would they move to the closing contingency?
That would be once all contingencies have been extinguished from that contract that the buyer has on their home. So for example, we would have to be past all due diligence. Now, there can still be the financing and other contingencies in there, appraisal, for example, but the big ones have to be gone. So those have to be cleared. So when that buyer that's presented this offer, their contract on their house, once they get that contract, we have to still go through the due diligence, and then we can move from sell and close over to the closing contingency.
Okay, so when they move from sale and closing to just a closing contingency, do they have to execute a new form?
No, actually they don't. All that's required is immediate notice. And I say immediate notice, and I'm sure you say this to probably yourself, agents in your office, and anyone you talk to, because if you don't give them immediate notice, keep in mind when you have that contingency out there, sell and close, there's something that could happen. So another offer could come in and wipe you out. So you want to move from sell and close to close and notify the other party immediately to get there. So those other offers maybe can be considered as backups, hopefully.
Okay.
So Jordan, if a buyer already has a contract on their home and they want to make an offer, should they make it contingent on sale and closing, or just closing if they're not through the due diligence period yet?
Actually going to be just closing.
And I'm going to give you an example to make sure I understand. So buyer Bob wants to offer on Susie Seller's house. He's got a contract on his home.
Mm-hmm.
It is still contingent on repairs for him. They haven't done any inspections or anything yet. He makes the offer, is contingent on just closing, because at that point the seller is completely in control. They can decide to accept that offer or not, knowing that the buyer still has his due diligence period to go through.
Exactly right. The seller's going to be in control there, and the reason being is because the seller, when presented with that, can then decide, do I want to wait to accept this once the due diligence is complete, or do I want to go ahead and accept it as is now?
And then just to follow up on that question, and let's say the buyer cancels the contract on Bob's house. Bob then needs to turn around within 1 day and inform Susie that his contract has fallen through, and then they could decide to make it contingent on sale and closing if they both want to proceed.
Sure, absolutely.
So the buyer could also just buy the home non-contingent if he can show a letter from his lender saying he doesn't need to sell first. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right.
Okay, so on a closed contingency, what is the exact date you put under the sentence that says the due diligence period or repairs must be completed by?
This one we see wrong all the time. So what's actually going to go there on that addendum is going to be the closing date of the buyer's current house. It actually doesn't make sense to use the date the due diligence period expires, because it should have already been removed or waived in order to use this contingency addendum to begin with.
Well, I have just learned something new. If another offer comes in on a sale and close, can you accept it?
Yes, although the new offer cannot contain a sale and closing contingency. So that's kind of the big difference there.
How about another offer on just a closed contingency?
So closed contingency, offers coming in on a closing contingency are only going to be considered as backup. So you can certainly accept those, but they're going to be backup offers only. They're not going to jump in front like it would be the case for a sell and close contingency.
Well, if you're on a closed contingency and the contract falls through on the buyer's house, what happens?
If the contract terminates on the buyer's house, then you can either move to sell and close if both parties agree to that. So it's almost like you're kind of moving backwards, in my opinion, because now there's no contract on the buyer's home. Or you can drop the contingency altogether. So I think a lot of people forget about that option. However, if either party or both parties agree to drop that contingency, the most important thing is that the buyer can show that they can still move forward with closing. I mean, think about it. You have financing, and if the lender says, no, you can't until your house is sold, that's going to be a problem. So the best thing there is going to be to have something in writing from the buyer's lender saying, sure, they can move forward without even selling their home. And I think that's the only kind of situation you could get around that.
Of course, and if the buyer never sells their house, when does that contract expire?
That's a great question, because this one we see all the time too. This is actually going to be the closing date in paragraph 7 of the contract. So this is actually a date outside the addendum that people need to remember are very important there. So this is where you usually see in section 7 of the contract, anytime there's a contingency involved, we see most agents doing, and maybe you do the same, like a 60, 90, or 120 day close. Because with a sell and contingency, for example, if you put a 30-day contract close date in paragraph 7, you're going to have a big issue there, because not only do you not have a contract to sell the house, but there's no way all this is going to happen in 30 days just to be able to close this contract that we're referring to.
Well, no doubt. So does the due diligence and other timeframes begin when the sale and close addendum is signed?
No, actually the due diligence begins once you move to close.
How about with a closed contingency?
That one's actually almost the exact opposite. Due diligence begins immediately, since we've already have a contract and date when the other home will close. So see, since we have that date, it's going to go ahead and start.
So what do you think about sale and close contingencies that have a right of refusal?
Have you ever seen those come in?
Back in the day, I haven't seen one in a while.
Yeah, it makes me scratch my head a little bit, but if your seller were to agree to not only the sell and close contingency, but with a right of first refusal attached to it, they're setting themselves up for probably a problem, I would think, because by doing that, you're giving the buyer the option to where if a new offer comes in, you can't just trump their offer now. They have the option to say, sure, you know what, I'll either increase the price to match that, but my sell and close contingency is going to remain. So if it remains, just think about it. If the only time you're going to be able to get rid of that sell and close contingency buyer with that right of first refusal is going to be if that date in paragraph 7 passes. So let's say that's 120 days from now. Well, if we get all the way to that 120 days, and they still don't have a contract on their house, and that right of first refusal, whether they've accepted it a few times, you can now be stuck 120 days out, now no contract, and you've already passed up other buyers. So, I mean, you'd be crazy to do that, I would think.
Well, definitely if I'm representing a seller, I'm going to recommend that gets struck out, because if I have a non-contingent offer come in, I'd certainly want to move forward with it.
Right, which, I mean, is kind of the whole reason of the sell and close contingency, to allow new offers to come in, as we've already talked about. So I think it's important, certainly, for your client.
Well, I know these forms are far superior to the way we used to do it before they existed a couple of years ago. So I think it's wonderful that we have forms that make sense for sale and closing contingencies.
And they're not perfect. I mean, you know, agents all the time can write new things in the contract or mark up the contract. So I think just both sides need to be aware of that. And if you're not following the addendums to a T, that either you understand how the addendum works, or you be careful about what your client's agreeing to. I mean, just putting ROFR in there can kind of be a disaster for your client that now maybe might not even have a buyer in 4 months.
Well, this has been incredibly enlightening. Thank you, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you. One thing, so growing up in Camden, on Wednesdays, and it's fitting because today's Wednesday afternoon, almost every business owner would stop their business at noon, and before church at 5 or 6 o'clock, they'd go to the golf course and play golf. So when I was working at the Camden Country Club in the summertime, we had our regulars every Wednesday. And so when I see this car, it reminds me of half the guys out there I would get their bags ready for. Man, this is I think we need to stop what we're doing and go play golf, because it's Wednesday afternoon, because we're driving in a Range Rover.
It is. That's funny. Growing up in Swansea, literally every Wednesday, every business on Main Street did the same thing. They closed at noon.
And then dentists and stuff would close Friday afternoon and do the same thing. So I guess depending on what business you were in would depend on when you did that. I don't know too many businesses that do that much anymore, though.
No.
Everybody's working more than 40-hour weeks.
Maybe we should start a trend. My office and your office, we can start closing on Wednesday afternoons.
I'm in.